Welcome to Build Students' Resiliency during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for joining us today. I hope it's a lovely day wherever you are. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be sent out tomorrow. Just a bit of background on the two companies that are hosting this webinar. Publish First is a new online platform that lets authors easily publish their content and gives readers an engaging experience. And you can learn more at publishfirst.com. That is actually with a number 1 in there. Human Resources Limited is a worldwide leader in the development and provision of online assessment, student success, and personal development programs. You can learn more about Human Resources at humanresources.com. And today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Aubrey and Dr. Brysacz here today to talk about student resilience and some of the steps you can take today to build not only your students' resilience, but hopefully also your own in the face of COVID-19. Dr. Thomas E. Rojo Aubrey is the Director of Behavioral Health Sciences and Professor at Glendale Community College in Glendale, Arizona, where he also serves as chair of the Behavioral Health Sciences Advisory Board and is a board member of the Exercise Science and Nutrition Advisory Council. He's also an adjunct professor at Northern Arizona State University. Dr. Aubrey has his doctorate in behavioral health from Arizona State University and is working on a second doctorate in cognitive psychology. Dr. Aubrey also serves on the Psychology Counseling Advisory Board for Grand Canyon University and the Advisory Board for the Arizona Trauma Institute. He also serves on the Advisory Board for the Cummings Graduate Institute for Behavioral Health Studies and is the co-author of Transformative Care, a trauma-focused approach to caregiving, as well as the Resilient Learner series, Thriving in College and Beyond, and Thriving and Succeeding in College. Our other presenter today is Dr. Lynn Brysacz, and she's a faculty member in the counseling department at Glendale Community College in Glendale, Arizona. Dr. Brysacz has been a counselor for over 30 years and taught and counseled in community colleges, universities, and a small liberal arts college. Dr. Brysacz earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from Santa Clara University, her master's in counseling at Arizona State University, and her doctorate in education at Arizona State University as well. In addition to her many years in higher education, Lynn served 2 years as the program director at the Counselor Support Community of Arizona, and Lynn is committed to facilitating personal growth, goal achievement, and resilience in individuals and communities. Lynn also enjoys spending time with friends and family, maybe a little less so right now, cooking, hiking, and enjoying the great outdoors. I am thrilled to have both of you here today, and we'll get started right away. And if anyone has questions during the presentation, they can feel free to ask a question. There's a raise hand or to type in the chat bar. Let me just make sure. We seem to be potentially having some sound issues. Okay. And today the agenda is to review mental health, patterns of stress activation, psychological and emotional resiliency, including self-regulation and social regulation, and then to provide resources for resiliency strength building. Dr. Aubrey, I'll pass the mic over to you.
Thank you, Tamara. So I think this is a great way to start off our presentation with the topic of mental health. If you're not aware of it, the month of May is Mental Health Awareness. So happy Mental Health Awareness for all our participants joining us today on the webinar. But this leads perfectly into the question, what is mental health? So when I say the word mental health, what comes to mind? Well, interestingly, the first thing that comes to mind for many, including mental health professionals, is pathology. Things like major depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, or ADHD. Unfortunately, this is a very narrow way of viewing mental health, in part because mental health involves the other side of the spectrum. It involves learning about good mental health. This means learning about what are the characteristics of good mental health and how can we build and maintain good mental health. Now, the reason why we want to learn how to build and maintain mental health, not just for us, but for all the faculty and educators and teachers today, to build it for your students, is with the hope of decreasing the likelihood of developing mental health problems in the near future, and to increase the likelihood of success in all areas of life. And I did say all areas of life because without good mental health, which is the key cornerstone to success, it becomes challenging for your students to become successful in school. It's difficult for them without good mental health to maintain focus in your class, to persist in your class, and to even persist towards graduation without good mental health becomes a challenge. Later, when your students wind up getting a job, or some of your students who are currently working, it becomes challenging without good mental health for them to have good productivity in their workplace and their relationships. Without good mental health, it can be an uphill battle. Now, to illustrate what I mean about an uphill battle, it's interesting because years ago, I was seeing a couple for marital counseling. Now, just to give a little bit of background on this couple, the husband was a professor in the communication department at a university. So, of course, because he's a professor in the comm department, we would think logically, man, this guy should have good communication skills in his marriage, but he didn't, which is one of the reasons why he was in therapy. Now, it's just think for let's take a second and analyze that, because it's interesting because he had the good knowledge, or he had knowledge of good communication skills. In fact, I recall in some of the sessions he would talk about the importance of elocution, or delivery of your messages in an effective way, so that that way the receiver can understand what you're trying to transmit, and vice versa. The other side of the coin, the importance, he would talk about the importance of good active listening skills to receive the messages in a way that the person's trying to deliver the message. And he would go through this explanation way beyond my knowledge of communication skills, but yet he lacked the fundamental ability to apply his knowledge. So the problem is that he did not have good resiliency or good mental health to address the common challenges of his marriage. So in moments, or heated moments during the marriage, what would happen is that he would lose access to the higher parts of his brain, the neocortex, that allows him to self-reflect and allows him the ability to use healthy communication skills. He had the knowledge, and like I said, because he was in a relaxed state, in a healthy state during therapy sessions, he was able to explain those knowledges, but in the moment that he needed them, he wasn't able to apply them. And that was because of the lack of resiliency or good mental health. So we can say that good mental health allows us to address the challenges in life. And by all means, your students are going through a lot of challenges. We're going through a lot of challenges with COVID-19. So it allows us to address the challenges of life. And by addressing these challenges, by accessing the higher parts of our brain, and through the access of the higher parts of our brain, we can apply the knowledge or the skills that we've learned over the years. And we'll talk more about this as this presentation evolves. So I'll go ahead and pass the baton over to my colleague, Dr. Brysacz, who will talk about the patterns of stress activation.
Thank you, Dr. Aubrey. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for spending time with us this afternoon. So back in the 1950s, Hans Selye identified stress as adapting to change. And right now, we're in the midst of an awful lot of change academically, the way that we teach, at home, at work, grocery shopping, even everything in our day-to-day existence is in the midst of change. And those changes, like any change, have the potential of activating our stress response, which is meant to facilitate our survival. When we perceive a change in the environment as threatening, our response can go in one of two directions. The first one, and the one that we hear about most often, is known as fight or flight. It's a hyper aroused state. We might react physically, oftentimes with movement, and emotionally by becoming frustrated, angry, anxious, or overwhelmed. An example of that might be when you're caught in traffic, or back before COVID-19 when we were driving and a lot of people were on the roads being caught in traffic. And at that point, a person might become hyper aroused, want to move, step on the accelerator, flip somebody off, maybe yell at somebody. So that's an example of being hyper aroused based on a threatening situation, or at least something that's perceived as threatening. On the other end of that stress activation response is being under aroused or hypo aroused. It's also known as freezing or dissociating. The observable responses on that end may include becoming distracted or zoned out, numb, frozen. An example might be if you're a math instructor, you might see students in your math class kind of zoning out. Oftentimes, it can be because they're stressed about this situation and they've gone into a freeze state or a hypo aroused state. Another example might be when a student gets called on in class, and perhaps you've been reading the things that they've written. Again, back when we were in the classroom, you might have read things that they've written. They seem to really be engaging with the material, but then you might call on them in class and they just freeze. And then another example might be testing too. I'm sure each of us has dealt with students that do well in the class, maybe do well in homework, and then their tests just don't show that same connection with the material. They leave things blank even, and you might know that they know that. And that's an example also of somebody in a hypo aroused state where they're just freezing and dissociating and not connecting with what's right in front of them. Where we want to be is in this area called the window of tolerance, which is the optimal zone of arousal, where we're able to manage and thrive in everyday life. In that space, we're clear headed and we engage in higher level thinking, and our learning is enhanced. Each individual's window of tolerance is different. People are generally more able to remain within their window of tolerance when they feel safe and supported. So, as an instructor, the type of environment we're attempting to create for our students is one in which they feel safe and supported. And with that, I'm going to let Dr. Aubrey take our next slide.
So it's quite interesting when we talk about the patterns of stress activation. One of the things that comes to my mind, and this may be something that many of you have seen when you were younger. When I tell this to my younger audience in classroom, they're like, "What are you talking about?" They've never seen this commercial. But when I was younger, there was this commercial about drugs, if you recall, where the individual showed an egg, held up an egg in his hand or her hand, and said, "This is your brain." Then that individual would crack the egg into a frying pan and then said, "This is your brain on drugs," as that egg started to sizzle in the frying pan. So this is really the section I'm really going to talk about is your brain on stress. What happens when we lose that sense of safety and then we're perceiving threat in our environment? So it's stressing out the brain because we don't feel safe enough. And what happens in the brain is the activity shifts from certain parts of the brain to other parts of the brain, and how can that impact your students' learning. So before I get started, it's really important to understand that stress is normal. It's really, just think of stress as your body's way to address the challenges of life. So when our body is stressed out and activates the stress response system, what it's doing is generating energy in the body to address the challenges in life. So that's a normal stage, and we want that stage, particularly in the lower parts of the brain. When that part of the brain is activated, it's because it doesn't perceive safety. It perceives that I'm not safe right now, there's a threat, there's danger, and it needs to then generate energy for survival in that moment. And when we're in a true dangerous and potentially life-threatening moment, this is a good survival skill. This will save your life. However, if it's a situation that's not life-threatening, it doesn't help you grow, flourish, or access the higher parts of the brain. So just to put this in perspective, what I like to do with my students in class, I like to give it an analogy. And of course, none of you as educators would ever do this, but imagine bringing a tiger into the classroom. And just imagine that tiger roaring around the classroom, just wandering and just roaring side by side, by each of your students. And at the same time that this tiger is roaring around the classroom, you're trying to teach them the periodic table. Now, do you think your students will be able to learn the periodic table? And obviously the answer is no, they would not. And sometimes when I ask this question to students and they answer, yeah, I can learn in that situation, I'll turn to that student and say, I'm sorry to tell you, but your survival skills suck. Because if you don't access that lower parts of the brain that'll allow you to survive so that tiger doesn't devour you, you're not going to make it to your first exam or your final. It's really important that your body does this, that it diverts energy from the higher parts of the brain. And that higher parts of the brain we can only access when we're feeling safe, when we're not feeling threatened. Then the brain starts activating the neocortex, or the higher parts of the brain, for abstract thinking, reflective thinking, problem solving, critical thinking skills, and even connection and bonding with others. These are the skills that you need your students to activate, to access in your classroom. If you're teaching math, you need your students to have access to abstract thinking for them to learn. If you're teaching poetry, you need your students to understand or access reflective thinking. Same thing with math, you need problem solving and critical thinking skills. But if they lose access to that parts of the brain, then the energy starts to being diverted. That brain goes offline, and energy starts to be diverted to the lower parts of the brain in order for survival. And I understand this is normal, this is natural. Going back to the analogy of the tiger, if I were to have just eaten a steak and a tiger is chasing me, blood flows away from the digestive system, from my stomach, to the extremities of my body for glucose to enter into my thighs, into my limbs, my arms, so I can fight or run away from that tiger. That's a natural survival skill. I don't need to digest that steak right now. That's not important. And it's the same thing that happens in the brain, is that your students, when they bring their problems into the class, because obviously you would not bring a tiger into the classroom, but yet they bring their past painful experiences or their current painful experiences or the trauma that they're encountering with COVID-19, they bring it into your classroom. So the brain doesn't feel safe. They lose access to that higher parts of the brain and all the skills that come with that part of the brain. And they start going into survival mode and seek safety. So this is so essential that you understand that, so we can understand our students of what's going on. Because sometimes we look at our students and we can't understand, why is it they don't get instructions? And if we could hear the pain and the fear that they bring into the classroom because of their personal life, then we can understand, well, their body is acting as it should, but it's not an effective way or an efficient way for them to be successful in your classroom. And that really is what we're going to be talking about, is how do we build that resiliency to get them back to this higher part of the brain. So we'll move on to the next slide. And I believe Dr. Brysacz will be talking a little bit about continuing on resilience and stress.
Yes, so some of you may be familiar with the Chinese character for crisis, with the Chinese word for crisis, which is actually two characters. So we are in the midst of a crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. And if we pull apart what crisis really is, it's presenting us with a danger and also at the same time presenting us with an opportunity. And if we look at the next slide, then our danger, our stress at this moment is the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have options about how we respond to this. So we can respond, as Dr. Aubrey said, from the lower parts of our brain where we simply react to a perceived threat, and that's meant to promote our survival. The unfortunate thing about that is in a chronically stressful situation that we're currently living in, then that chronic stress activation makes us vulnerable to diseases of chronic stress and to the poor choice of avoiding the stressor. Instead, what we want to promote here is an opportunity to build resilience, to make the choice of building resilience. Those are the skills that we'll be teaching. And when we make that choice, or when our students make that choice to build resilience and to act from that higher part of their brain, that can result in a healthier body and a healthier mind. I'll let Dr. Aubrey go from here.
Yeah, so just let's talk about what is the opportunity that we're talking about, and then we'll move into specific examples of those opportunities that you can teach your students and also practice in your life. But to take a look at, we're going to talk about preventing traumatic stress, but to illustrate, because really traumatic stress are just painful experiences in life, but to illustrate how painful experiences can intrude into the present moment, because that's what we're talking about up to now, that these painful experiences, whether it's current or whether it's in the past, intrude into the present moment. And when they intrude in the classroom, they interrupt the ability for students to access the parts of the brain that allow them to become successful in your classroom, allow them to learn, allow them to grow. So to illustrate this, in my classroom, I like to have a brief discussion about an adult elephant who is bonded by a rope. And I ask my students, how does an elephant get to the point where a simple rope can restrain this massive creature? And it's interesting because we have this back and forth discussion, and students will come up, well, this is what they do, or this is what the trainer does. But in the end, we come to the conclusion, to make a long story short, that basically what happened is, at a very early age, this elephant that was a baby didn't have the strength of an adult. And the trainer bonded that elephant with a rope, or maybe even a chain. And that elephant tugged and tugged and tugged and tugged and tugged and tugged. And the next day it tugged again and it tugged again and tugged and tugged and tugged. And eventually its spirit was broken. And it developed a message through this pain, past experience of failure. I can't do it. I'm not strong enough. That's the traumatic stress that was internalized in the body. That failure was internalized in the body, and it learned, because that's all trauma is a painful learned experience that teaches you to prevent that situation from reoccurring in the future. So what's the reoccurrence? I just don't try anymore, because every time I try, I feel like a failure. And to avoid that, I avoid the situations. And do we have students that do that? Students that tell you, I can't, my brain doesn't work this way. I can't learn math. It's too challenging. It's too difficult. Or if there are any advisors that are joining us, students that reluctantly will not take math. Well, can I take math the next semester and next semester? Well, can I hold on to math to the next semester? Those are those traumatic experiences, those failures in life that were internalized, those painful experiences. And basically all we're doing is we're building an opportunity of resilience to teach our students. There's 6 skills that we train our students to equal resolution and sustain resilience. We're going to be talking about 2 of them in today's lecture: self-regulation and social regulation. And if we can apply these 2 skills in the current moment, during the time that we're experiencing these emotions that may be evoked by triggers in our environment, and we're able to relax and we're able to sustain that during the same time, we can develop, or we can teach our students to develop resolution or healing of past learning for growth in the future, or even sustained resilience where they don't develop those negative learning that intrudes into their present moment and impedes success. So let's start off with the next slide with self-regulation. And now there's many methods of self-regulation, and I've just listed a few up here. And there's probably some that I haven't listed that you use. In fact, I like to take some quiet walks. We can still continue doing walks. We might have, if we walk with someone, we have to keep that 6 feet distance, but we can still continue there. But there's many ways, and the purpose with this slide is to show that there's not one way of doing self-regulation. You'll need to find what's the best way for you, and you'll need to help your students explore what's the best way for them to self-regulate. So you're welcome to come back to this slide at another time. Maybe some of your students use music. Encourage the using of music, but encourage it at the same time that they're experiencing distress in life. So moving on to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So basically, when we're talking about self-regulation, whatever tool that you're using, some of the tools that you've used that were mentioned in the prior slide, or others that we're not mentioning, basically what we're doing is we're shifting the bodily states to support a sense of safety. Because what happens, if you take a look at moments that you feel threatened, and this is the same thing because it's happening in the bodies of your students. In the moments that you feel threatened, what happens is that your body tenses up. And like we spoke about, we mentioned earlier, that is a natural response because my fists are probably tensing up because I'm preparing to fight something. The problem is in the classroom, these are perceived threats that are not real. They're imaginary threats because my life is not really in danger in that moment. But my body is reacting as such, as if there was a tiger in the room coming in. I need to seek safety and survival. So the opposite end is when my body feels safe in an environment. And you probably experienced this, and we'll talk about, Dr. Brysacz will talk about this in the next section. You probably experienced this as you're dysregulated because of an event or a trigger that just occurred. And then you talk to someone and that person's able to soothe you down. And if you notice what's happening in your body starts to relax. That's what we're talking about, doing this on your own, self-regulation. What are some skills I can do to change my bodily state into a more relaxed state? So that way my mind starts to perceive that I'm safe. I don't need to access the lower parts of my brain. What I need to do is start accessing the higher parts of my brain to access problem-solving skills to resolve the current situation at hand. So what I'm going to go ahead and talk about is acute relaxation, because some of the skills that we had just mentioned earlier were deep relaxation skills. However, in acute relaxation skills, it doesn't invoke deep relaxation, just enough relaxation to trigger that relaxation response in the body. But the cool thing with this technique is that you can use it in the moment that you're feeling stressed out. Contrary to some of the other tools, it's very challenging for me to, in the moment of a heated argument with someone, to tell them, can you hold on 1 second? Let me go ahead and do some deep breathing exercises. It's awkward. But here's one tool that you can do in the moment that you're having a heated discussion with someone, or you're having a discussion with your boss or with your student that's upsetting, and vice versa, teaching them how to do something, that you can do it in that moment to activate the body's relaxation response and then access the higher parts of the brain, to access the neocortex, to have better communication skills. And basically all it is we call this a body scan. And my colleague, Dr. Gentry, actually calls it a wet noodle, because as you'll see, the body just goes limp. So all you need to do is you can start from head to toe or toe to head. It doesn't really matter where you start. And what you'll do is just be aware of your muscles, of tension, particularly in the muscles. So you can start with your facial muscles and just notice, are there any tension in the facial muscles? How about the shoulders? And if there's any tension in the facial muscles or the shoulders, all you need to do is just loosen them up. So you're tensing your muscles. It's not nobody else tensing the muscles. So you can easily just relax them. And sometimes it may take some practice to do that. But with some practice, you can just loosen them. Drop the shoulders and loosen them. And continue going down and scanning each and every part of your body, down to the hips, to the thighs, to the shins. And as you go through and you scan those areas of the body, you just loosen the muscles. And you can do this now. Of course, I took longer than 5 seconds now, but you can do this within 5 seconds. It's a skill that I teach students that they can do in the middle of a test. They can just scan their body and just loosen the muscles. They don't have to do some deep breathing exercises or close their eyes where they may draw the attention of others. It's just a simple exercise, and it's enough to activate the parasympathetic nervous system so that they induce a relaxation response in the body. Now, here's the power with this. Before we move on to the next section, is that you can do it in the moment, in real time. And if we continue pairing a distressful situation with relaxed body, a distressful situation with a relaxed body, with time, what happens is healing starts to occur. You start to desensitize yourself to that distressor. And as an example, I had a particular student in one of my class who, when she was given particularly pop quizzes, but any kind of quizzes in her math class, she would express how she would just tense up and freeze. She could not answer the questions. And at the end of the class, she would turn in a blank quiz or a blank midterm and final. So she had failed her math class and was fearful that she would fail it again. And she then was enrolled in my college success course upon the recommendation of her advisor. And one of the skills that I taught her was this body scan. I told her each and every time you go into the classroom, doesn't matter if you're doing a quiz or not, I want you to scan your body and notice what muscles are tensed. And sure enough, she told me that, every time she would come into the classroom, her entire body was tense. And just to go back to what we were explaining earlier, the reason why her body was tensing because of past learned experiences was triggering her threat response system. So her body was tensing up, ready to fight a perceived threat that wasn't real. It was real in the past. She struggled with math in the past in grade school, but she brought those painful past memories into the present, and it was intruding from her becoming successful in college. So I asked her every single class, just practice the body scan. So you're doing it in the moment that you're experiencing the trigger. And about halfway through the semester, she came back and started expressing how her body was relaxing a lot more during classroom. And she even mentioned that during her midterm, she didn't freeze. So she started to desensitize from the distress of being in a math class. And she was able to succeed and graduate. And now is moving on to NAU, Arizona State, Northern State University, in the field of mental health. So that's just one of many examples of students that have utilized this to heal from their past learned experiences. So let's move on to social regulation, and Lynn will then, or Dr. Brysacz will then discuss how to use social regulation to induce a relaxation response and heal within the context of relationships.
So, as Dr. Aubrey just said, another way to promote the relaxation response is through interpersonal connection and support. And that can help us to build resiliency. So, the way to do that is to have some kind of a sanctuary, a place where you feel safe, honored, respected. That's what we hope for our students as well, that they feel safe and honored and respected. We want that to happen in the classroom environment, as Dr. Aubrey said, because sometimes they bring past painful experiences into the classroom where that's not what they have felt. As an instructor, we may be the only person that a student has contact with in a particular day, especially now with COVID-19, since they're not in the classroom. So we have this incredible opportunity to offer that safety and to honor our students and respect them so that they have what they need to build resilience. I offer another example too, because it's important to consider your personality as you build support, or your students' personality. For me personally, I had to think about how to build a support system when in July of 2018, I was diagnosed with cancer. And it was a startling diagnosis. I wasn't expecting that. I certainly wasn't looking forward to the treatment. I felt threatened by that. So my stress activation kicked in. Being a counselor and somebody that has training in resiliency, I knew that I needed to create some kind of support system for myself. I knew that was going to be essential. And as mentioned in my bio, I had worked for a couple of years for the cancer support community, where we provided free professional support for people dealing with cancer. I decided that wasn't the way for me to go, to join one of the support groups. I wasn't sure that I could make that commitment. For one, it's a weekly commitment. And then also, I knew those people, the facilitators of the support group, as peers in another way. And I wasn't sure that I would feel safe as a participant in a support group. So I went to an organization called Caring Bridge. It's a platform where people who are dealing with some kind of health crisis can write about what they're experiencing, can offer updates for people who are interested in supporting them and knowing what's going on. And I've kept a journal, diary, since I was 10 years old. So writing about what I'm feeling and thinking comes second nature to me. And that was what I realized is what I needed. I needed that way of expressing myself, to share the narrative of my traumatic experience in a way where others could support me in a way that was meaningful to me. And they supported me by writing immediately. When I would post something on Caring Bridge, immediately I would get responses from people. And that helped my healing as I went through that traumatic experience. Um, we want our students to have options about how they create their support system. And also, we want them to be able to have a support system that knows how to support them. So they might need to train their support system. Dr. Aubrey directs our behavioral health science program. And in that program, the students are offered mental health first aid training, which is a national program training people in first aid. And this time it's mental health first aid. And that is a great way that those students learn about how to care for each other and how to support each other. In this era of COVID-19, we might need to get creative about how we support each other, how we engage in a supportive environment. Uh, Sometimes there's some video chatting. I've been involved in a number of birthday parties via Zoom, phone, texting. My sister recently organized a parade for her best friend's father's 85th birthday. And they weren't able to leave the house, but what everybody did is they got in cars and bikes and walking. They had signs and they went past the house singing happy birthday, wishing my friend's dad happy birthday. And that meant a lot to him. And it was just another way for him to be able to feel supported and safe. On the next slide, we're going to look at the importance of a healthy system to be able to do these things. So if we're going to engage in self-regulation and social regulation, we need to also make sure that our body is healthy. Right now, a lot of us are probably working extra hours. We're stressed trying to bring classes online if we were teaching face-to-face. We have more childcare responsibilities, maybe more household responsibilities. It's really important during this time and all time, if we're going to be building resilience, to take care of our physical body. So to have healthy sleeping, eating, and exercise routines. We need to be able to refuel our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves, or we'll burn out and not be able to provide the supportive, creative learning opportunities we want to give our students. I think of this as the same way that they instruct when you're on a plane and they give the safety instructions. You have to put on your mask before you can put on anybody else's mask. So we have to make sure that we're caring for ourselves, that we have the internal resources we need in order to be able to provide for our students what it is we want to give them. So with this, I'm going to turn it back to Dr. Aubrey, who's going to mention the other areas of resilience building.
Yeah, so we only mentioned two, or we addressed three actually here, but zeroed into two of them and gave you some skills to build on those. But you can see up here, there's actually a 6-point resiliency system. So there's 6 areas of resiliency that, and I have to emphasize this, it's not just the resiliency that we should be teaching our students, but it's a resiliency that you as faculty, as educators, as teachers, should also be practicing in your daily life. Because if we don't practice this, our students will know. Our students will know that we're not putting into practice yet. We're trying to have them practice these skills that we're not practicing, and they'll pick up that. And they'll learn more from our behaviors than from what we're saying. So when I teach these resiliency skills, whether it's to an organization or whether it's to faculty members, I tell them the first thing you need to do is first practice these resiliency skills on yourself, master these skills, and then you can become a better instructor as you teach these skills. And sometimes even myself, I've been practicing for years, and sometimes I have to remind myself to go back. Let's do some, for example, the first one, self-regulation. Just today, I injured my back, so I'm going through this presentation with some pain. And as Dr. Brysacz was going through the social regulation, I had to even remind myself, hey, let me zone in and Dr. Brysac's voice, because she has a calming voice. And as I was listening to her voice, my pain was just disappearing. It was dissipating. And that's the power of that, at least social regulation that we talked about. But self-regulation is, we mentioned that earlier. Mental flexibility is really just the ability to see things from a different perspective. And if we're able to see things from a different perspective, we're able to choose the perception that best matches or best gives us the ability to achieve our goals. So here's the definition. I'm not going to go through all of them because with just a lack of time, I want to have some time for questions and answers, but self-regulation, mental flexibility is number 2. Focus of area that you'll be not just practicing in yourself, but with others. Motivation and self-direction. Take some time later after the slide to read the definition. And what are some of the skills that you'll be training or teaching your students to do to master this area of focus? Positive psychological strengths really is the positive psychology, and those are areas to enhance your students' life, quality of life, to enhance your own quality of life as well. Moving on to the next slide, we can see area number 5, interpersonal connection and support, what Dr. Brysacz spoke about. Very powerful tool to use. And like I said, we can use that in moments that we least think it's effective, such as in moments that you're experiencing pain, like myself, and hearing the voice. Our brain, our nervous system is wired to connect, to hear the voice of others, to heal, even physical pain. Self-care and revitalization, we spoke about that. Important to know in that area that it's really, when a lot of people think about self-care, they think about bubble baths and eating chocolate. Well, those are good soothing skills. They're not self-regulation. Self-care. Self-care is really the things that on the back end that we don't want to do that refuels our body. And as I tell my students, think of your body like a car. It needs to be refueled. If you continue going and accelerating your body without refueling, eventually you'll burn out. And that's why it's so essential that you take care of your body through self-care and revitalization by refueling it with those practices that we discussed earlier: healthy eating, healthy activity, healthy sleep, and healthy self-compassion. So moving on to the next slide, I want to make sure that we also give you some resources for building resiliency. Particularly right now with COVID-19, these are resources that you can use, your family can use, and you can share with your students as well. I won't go over those. You'll have access to the PowerPoint, and you can click on those links and get more additional information. Now, for moving on to the next slide, I want to make sure we have some time for questions. I think we have about 12 minutes, and in the next slide, as we're answering the questions, you'll have access to an email and a web link if you want to find out how can I bring resiliency to my campus, or how can I bring resiliency to my school, or just simple, how can I bring resiliency to my classroom. So there's a link that you can go and access a book that on how to build resiliency for your students. And then you can also send any additional questions to Carla at that email mentioned on the slide. And if needed, she will reach out to Dr. Brysacz or myself if it's a question that we need to be also involved in. So let's open it up for some questions.
There's a few different ways, depending on how you're signed into the webinar, that you may be able to ask questions. You may see a question mark, and you can click on that question mark to enter in your question, or you can also, if there's a questions panel, that you see a tab as represented on the right there if you have any questions. And I don't see any at the moment. Just give it a minute or two. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and it will be available by tomorrow. You'll receive it with an email.
And as questions come in, it's really important that folks understand this is a novel way of supporting student success. Because one, we're addressing something that rarely is addressed in the educational system is how do we build good mental health? And as we discussed earlier, we're not talking about, although it helps individuals who are struggling with thoughts of suicide or depression. We're not really talking about the pathology. But we're talking about how do we build good mental health for individuals for them to become successful. And through the practice of building good health, it can result in getting on a path to recovery from pathologies such as major depressive disorder. But more importantly, our focus is really just building the good mental health so they have the skills to become successful in life.
I don't see any questions. I think I'll take that as they've been answered throughout the presentation. And I'll thank Dr. Aubrey and Dr. Brysacz once again for their time today. And thank you to everybody for your time for showing up for this webinar.
Yes,
And
thank you, everybody. All the best to you.
Absolutely. Particularly, I hope everyone keeps themselves safe during this time. And we're here to support you in any way. So don't hesitate to reach out if after the webinar a question comes up and it's like, oh, I should have asked that question. You can still reach out to that address, that email there, and ask that question. And by all means, Carla will reach out to us and we'll answer in the best way we can.
Absolutely. Thank you for spending time.
thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. And if you have a moment, please fill out the survey as well that you'll receive after the webinar and in the link in the email as well. Thank you again. Have a great day.